Today we're carrying on looking through the book of Zechariah. It's the last of our series looking at the first half, dealing with the visions of Zechariah, before we get into the final sort of three prophetic messages. Um, Now previously we've covered these eight parallel visions, starting with the different colored horses and the horses with chariots, talking about how God sends his angels forth throughout the world to bring about his will, which was the Persian armies going forth to restore Israel back to their home, to bring peace to the world, so that his spirit might have rest when his people are again returned home. The four horns and carpenters and the woman, the ephah, dealt with the sort of the exile, the God's people being carried away captive because of their sins, and then restored back to the land at the end of that 70 years to be rebuilt the right way. The measuring of Jerusalem and the flying scroll deals with, God's plan for how he wants his people to be restored. That Jerusalem would be the city without wars, for its prosperity, the amount of blessings that he's pouring out, and that God would be able to pour out this abundance of blessings without restraint upon his people, because it would be his law that is flying through the land, governing everyone, that everyone would be led by that, living a holy and righteous life. So there is nothing to stop God pouring out his blessings. And then the final two, sort of the pinnacle of this sort of pyramid chiasm structure, with Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel, we see that this picture of the ministration in the sanctuary for God's people with Joshua, and the ministration of the angels for God's people with the message of Zerubbabel. Now, these are those eight parallel visions. What we're going to look at today is the final part in chapter 6. And in chapter 6 there, the final prophetic message is not actually a vision as such. All of these were visions that are given sort of interpretations and messages within them. But the final part of chapter 6 is not a vision. It's just a separate prophetic word that comes that's separate from the structure, but sort of serves as sort of like a final end cap, that all of this is leading towards that. And in this final prophetic word, we see a picture of Christ as the Messiah, that branch that comes from the root of David. That, and he sits as a priest upon his throne. We see him there as prophet, priest, and king. We see him there building the true temple of God. Whereas the one that Zerubbabel was led to build here, as doing the work of God, was this type, the temple in Jerusalem that was pointing forward to the true Christ, the true temple that we see Christ building there in chapter 6. We see him there, seated upon his throne. We see him there in the councils with the Father and Son together in those heavenly councils. So all of these visions are sort of leading God's people towards this final point, which is this sort of revelation, this manifestation of the fullness of Christ and everything that he is doing for his people. What is going to do as the Messiah when he comes, what he's going to do as priest for his people, what he's going to do as king when he returns for his people. And so with that frame in mind, that all these visions was God telling a story of what happened to his people while they were taken away captive, how he wants to restore them, what he's doing for them. It's all leading straight towards the one who is doing this for them, the one who is taking God's people through this journey, who is there with them all this way, leading them towards Christ, as all God's people being led to Christ. So with that frame in mind, we're going to start looking at the last part of chapter 6. Now, it's a very sort of simple passage. It comes in three parts. First, there is this theme where they're told to make a crown and put it on the head of Joshua. Then we get the prophetic word that sort of is explaining what is this meaning, what is the symbol representing. And then after that, they're told to take that crown and to place it in the temple. And first, I just want to look at sort of what they're told to do with the crown at the beginning and ending of this vision. And then we're going to look at the message and the meaning behind what happened. So it starts off here in verse 9. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, take of them of the captivity, even Hildah and Tobijah, and of Jediah, which are come from Babylon, and come thou the same day, and go into the house of Joseph, the son of Zephaniah, and take silver and gold, and make crowns, and set them upon the head of Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest. So Zechariah is receiving this word. God tells him to go and find these people that have returned from Babylon, and to make this crown for Joshua. Now, just to give just a little bit of background, if you're familiar with the story, when Cyrus gave the command at the end of Chronicles and beginning of Ezra sort of starts with Chronicles, left off, and carries on there. We read that he gives the command for the people to return back. And as part of that command, he tells them, who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judea, and build the house of the Lord, God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. And whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of this place help him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts, besides the freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. And so when the people were given this sort of permission, this decree by Cyrus to return and to rebuild the temple, that they left there, and they were taking all this gold and silver and these goods that have been given an offering for the temple of God back with them. And as they've returned there, this has all been stored up there, sitting there waiting for the restoration of the temple. And Zechariah's got to go and find these people with these offerings that they had brought for the temple, and make a crown to place on Joshua's head. And once they've done that, then this prophetic word is uttered to the people. They're given this message why Joshua is sitting there with this crown on his head. But after that happens, we then carry on reading. After the prophetic word is uttered in chapter 6, we read, and the crown shall be to Helam and to Tobijah and to Jediah and to Hen the son of Zephaniah for a memorial in the temple of the Lord. And they that are afar off shall come and build in the temple of the Lord. And ye shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto you. And this shall come to pass, if you will diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God. So one sort of point I want to make here, while they've taken this gold that has been brought back from the offering of the temple, and they've taken that to sort of do this sort of prophetic display, making this crown for Joshua. And he's sat there, he's got the crown on his head, this prophetic message is given. But then after that, Joshua doesn't get to keep the crown. The crown is then taken and actually put in the temple. And that's an important point. We're going to come to this later, when we once we read the message. We're going to come back to this about the fact that Joshua didn't get to keep the crown. So just keep that in mind. Now we're just going to jump into what this message was that was spoken while Joshua was wearing, why Joshua was sitting there as the high priest wearing this crown for a king. And we read here in chapter 6, and speak unto him. So this is while Joshua is sitting there with that crown on his head. Zechariah is told to speak unto him, saying, thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, behold, the man whose name is the branch, and he shall grow up out of this place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Even he shall build the temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule upon his throne, and he shall be a priest upon his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. So we get this messianic prophecy of, even more than messianic. It's not just dealing with him coming as the branch during his messianic ministry on earth. It's dealing with his high priestly ministry as well, and that transitioning into his kingly ministry, sitting as a priest upon his throne. And there's so much in here, and we're going to break this down and look at it. But there's so much in here about Christ, about his ministry, about who he is. But one of the things that stands out to me the most is that final line that's spoken there, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. It's such a a clear text that displays the truth of the Father and Son. You know, that the councils of heaven compose the Father and the Son, that they are both in there. The council of peace between both Father and Son. There's no room for anyone else in there. And that really highlights that significance of that father-son relationship, that truth that is presented throughout the Bible. But as is common with any truth, no matter how clear in the Bible, there's always a way that people use to sort of muddy the waters and avoid what is being said here. And this text is no different, because a lot of people have issues with this because it portrays so clearly the truth of the Father and Son. And the argument they say is that this is not actually referring to Jesus at all, that nothing in this prophetic message that was spoken here is messianic at all, that it's all actually just talking about Joshua. When it says the man whose name is the branch, that's a name that's being given to Joshua. They're saying Joshua is the branch. Joshua will build the temple. Joshua shall sit and rule upon his throne. Joshua shall be the priest and the king. And the council of peace shall be between Joshua and God. Just like Moses, when God called Moses up into the mountain and communed with him and gave him instructions and counsel to go and deliver to Israel, that was going to happen here with Joshua. And so that's what they say. They say there is nothing in this that actually talks about Christ. There's nothing messianic. It's all only speaking to Joshua and about him. But there's a number of problems with that. But the first one is what I mentioned before. Remember how we said they made the crown, they put it on Joshua's head. He sat there. This word was spoken to him, but after it was spoken, what happened? He didn't keep wearing the crown. The crown was then taken and put in the temple as a memorial, as sort of like a thing that they would remember what had been spoken, just like when Moses took the manna and Aaron's staff and put them in the temple, so they would be there as a remembrance of how God had provided for them and how God had spoken. So too, this crown was going to be put there as a reminder of this. It wasn't going to stay on Joshua's head. Joshua never ruled as a king. You know, Joshua wasn't the one that actually built the temple. As we looked at last time, Zerubbabel was the one who was credited with building the temple. That was the message in chapter 4. God says clearly that Zerubbabel will be the one who builds the temple at Jerusalem. And so we see, first off, just on the face of it, that this doesn't make sense applying just to Joshua. And we see that, in fact, Joshua here is being used as a symbol, a type, a sign of Christ that is to come. And we see this is actually a common thing that happened throughout Scripture. We're going to look at just a couple of examples to show where this takes place elsewhere with other prophetic messages. Here in Ezekiel 4, beginning at verse 1, we read, "Thou also, son of man, take thee a tile and lay it before thee, and portray upon it the city, even Jerusalem, and lay siege against it, and build a fort against it, and cast a mount against it, and set a camp against it, and set battering rams round about it. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel." So what Ezekiel's doing here is he's giving a prophecy about how Jerusalem will be besieged. The Babylonians will come and besiege the city and destroy it. And he doesn't just speak the message, he actually acts it out. You know, like if you've seen those people doing their little war games and they get their little miniature army figurines and they reenact battles and how troops are deployed. This is what Ezekiel was doing. He was told to get this tile to portray the city, to draw it out there, and then to put in, you know, siege equipments, battering rams, fortifications against the city, and to display that. So there would be a visual representation of what is going to happen. And then following on from this, he's actually told to lie on his left side for a number of days, according to the iniquity of the house of Israel, and then on his right side a number of days, according to the iniquity of the house of Judah. A day for a year is what he's told. And so they're actually told to act out these things. Now, them acting it out isn't the reality. That people weren't supposed to see that and be like, oh, look at this what's happening to Ezekiel. Okay, they're supposed to look at what's happening to Ezekiel and realize that he's acting out something that is going to happen in the future, that God is using us to teach them about a reality. This is the same thing that's happening with the entire sanctuary system. Okay, that's not the reality, but that was to teach them about the reality. They were acting that out so that people could look at that and see that God's trying to show them something else. And that's why it says here that there shall be a sign to the house of Israel. We see the same thing in Isaiah 20. In verse 2, it says, at the same time spake the Lord by Isaiah, the son of Amos, saying, go and loose the sackcloth from off thy loins, and put off thy shoes from thy foot. And he did so, and walked naked and barefoot. And the Lord said, like as my servant Isaiah hath walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and a wonder upon Egypt and upon Ethiopia. And he carried on to say how the Egyptians and the Ethiopians will be destroyed, and they will be carried away, and everything will be taken from them, and they will be stripped of everything. And I mean, it seems like a fairly a weird way to get across a prophetic message, but it sort of gets across a point that is quite strong, that has to be made this way, because God's people seem to have a problem of listening when God just uses words. So here he uses actions. And again, Isaiah walking around naked, he didn't do that because of the Babylonians. He did that to show what the Babylonians would do to the Egyptians. It was a sign and a wonder, as it says there. And there's a number of other times when it happens, where Ezekiel had to pack up all the stuff and dig through the wall and move out to show how God's people would be taken away captive. Jeremiah had to take this linen girdle and wear it all the way to Euphrates and hide it in a cleft of the rocks and come back to it to show it was destroyed, about what would happen to Israel. And again, he wore a ox yoke around his neck to show how all the world would be under the yoke of Babylon. These are all signs that would happen. That the point is not what was happening when they acted it out, it was what that was referring to. These were all to point them to something else. And we see the same thing happening here with Joshua the high priest, sitting there with this crown on his head. The point is not that Joshua has a crown upon his head. The point is that Joshua is being a sign, a symbol of something else that is to come, that God is trying to use that to teach us something else. And it's interesting, because we have Joshua here, and then the first thing we talked is behold the man whose name is the branch. This prophetic utterance is speaking about this messianic figure as the branch. And we see a similar thing when we looked at Zechariah chapter 3 here, with Joshua and the branch as well. Now, just here in reading verse 8, it says, hear now, O Joshua the high priest, thou and thy fellows that sit before thee, for they are men wondered at. For behold, I will bring forth my servant the branch. And so here it specifically says that they are men wondered at, that they are a wonder, a sign. This is the same word used there in Isaiah and Ezekiel. And Joshua as the high priest himself, that the whole position of a high priest is that it was to represent Christ. People was to look at the high priest ministering in the sanctuary, and they were to look at that and understand what Christ is doing in the true sanctuary, in the heavenly sanctuary. And so this is the same thing we see happening here in Zechariah chapter 6 with Joshua the high priest with a crown upon his head. Okay, Joshua is not the one who will have this council of peace with the Father. He's not the one who rules as a priest upon his throne. He acts this out, and then the crown's taken and put in the temple as a memorial. He is the one who is acting this out so people would see and realize that there is a true messianic king who will be our priest ministering for us on our behalf before God in the true temple. But the reason people have a hard time grasping this is because of what it requires of them. Just like when Christ came the first time, the Jews had a hard time accepting him because they had what their traditions set up, their way of living set up. They thought that what God required was the blood of a goat sprinkled on the Ark of the Covenant once a year. What God required was the feast to be kept. What God required was the service of the sanctuary. That was the reality. That they failed to see that was only a symbol, a type pointing forward to the reality. So when Christ, the reality, came, If they were to accept that, that would require them to change everything that they had been understanding and practicing, and they weren't ready to change. So they rejected the reality and held on to the shadow as though it was the reality. And the same thing is happening to people when they come and read this passage. When it speaks about Christ here and having the counsel of peace between him and the Father, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. Okay, the truth of that reality, the truth of the Father and Son comes to people, but to accept that requires them to change. And a lot of people don't like that. So instead of accepting the reality, they looked at the shadow, they looked at the type, they look at Joshua sitting there with a crown upon his head, and they grasp onto that shadow as though it is the reality. And they refuse to accept the reality that is being presented right before them. It's interesting that the parallel between what is happening often in the interpretation of this passage and what happened with the Jews when Christ came and started speaking about the reality, when they held on to that types and shadows. Paul says in Corinthians that, in the reading of Moses and the reading of the scriptures, there's this veil over their face, that they cannot behold the glory of the reality because they refuse to accept Christ and his position as that reality. But it says that when they turn to the Lord, that veil shall be taken away. It says, the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And it's the same thing happening here, and happens with many other passages, that veil is over people's face because they refuse to accept the reality of who Christ is, of that Father and Son. And so in doing that, there is this veil over their face where they cannot behold the true glory that is being revealed in the scriptures. And so what we're going to do now, we started off looking at Joshua sitting there as this sign, as this type, as this shadow, where Christ is the reality. Now we're going to go through that passage is bit by bit and say, what are the prophetic things that are being spoken here, and what is the reality that they're teaching us about Christ? Now, the first thing we're told here, the first thing that is spoken when Joshua is sitting there as the shadow, that this type of Christ is to come, is, behold the man whose name is the branch, and he shall grow up out of his place. So I just want to look at sort of two passages that deal with the branch. Where does this name, this title of the Messiah, come from? Well, first here in Isaiah 11 verses 1 or 2, we read, and there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his root. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. So again, this is speaking of that messianic figure coming from, Jesse, the father of King David. And so it's saying, coming from that Davidic line, this branch will grow up. But I want to notice here, it's very interesting how it speaks of this and the words it uses here, because it tells us two things, that a rod shall grow out of the stem of Jesse, and then a branch out of his root. But then it says, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. So there is as one individual being spoken of here. It is resting upon him, but it's speaking of us having two origins, right? Jesse's spoken here as being like a tree, the idea of like a family tree, but there's a rod growing out of the stem. Okay, so the sort of the trunk of the plant grows up, and then there's a branch growing out. This is the sort of messianic branch growing out of the stem as a descendant of Jesse, a descendant of David. But there's also a branch growing out of the root. It was what's referred to as a suckling or a runner that comes up off the root. And so it's coming from the root, which is sort of the origin of Jesse and David. And so we get this idea that this messianic figure has two origins. One as a descendant of Jesse and David, and one as sort of the progenitor. He comes before them and he came after them. And we see the same thing when it speaks about in the New Testament as Christ being the root and the offspring of David. he has these two origins. He was before him and created all humanity and began the entire human race, and then he was born into it as a descendant of the human race. This is what John the Baptist said, where he said, "He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me." That Christ has these two origins. He was born on earth as the son of David, but he has another origin, being born in heaven as the Son of God before he created all of humanity. And so here we see that there's this messianic origins of the branch. And as we go through these things, you'll see that again, this just shows further evidence that it clearly can only be referring to Christ. That there is no way that this could be referring to Joshua. Every single thing is just clearer and clearer as you go through. Now, here again in Jeremiah 23, verse 5, it says, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is the name whereby he shall be called, the Lord our righteousness." So again, this branch will run. Of the seed of David. Okay, this branch would come. He shall be a king. He shall reign. He shall save God's people, and his name is the Lord our righteousness. And that Lord there, that's the covenant name of God. That's Yahweh, Jehovah our righteousness. And of course, we've already had him referred to as the branch back in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 8, where Joshua was told, okay, this is you're a sign of these things to come, and I will bring forth my servant the branch. Now, following on from that, once he's named the branch, this messianic figure that would come, the Christ, the first thing we're told about him is, "And he shall build the temple of the Lord." Even he shall build the temple of the Lord. Now, the first question I ask when I read something like this is, which temple is that talking about? And we know it's not the temple in Jerusalem. We know it can't be that, because, well, for one, we've looked previously in Zechariah where we're told that Zerubbabel was building that. It says, "Who art thou, O great mountain of Zerubbabel? Thou shalt become a plain, and he shall bring forth the headstone thereof with crying, with shouting, crying, grace, grace unto it." And then again in verse 9, "The hand of Zerubbabel has laid the foundation of this house. His hand shall also finish it, and thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto you." And we covered this last time we looked at it, that Zerubbabel was building the temple in Jerusalem. But this is speaking about the Messianic king who would come and build a temple. And so we asked the question, what temple is that? And I just want to jump back to chapter 3 again, where we looked at the branch being mentioned here, because it's interesting what it goes on to say after I brought with my servant the branch. It says, "For behold, the stone that I have laid before Joshua, upon one stone shall be 7 eyes. Behold, I will engrave the graving thereof, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of the land in one day." And so I just noticed a couple of parallels between chapter 3 here and chapter 6. We have Joshua being there as a sign, as a wonder. We have God speaking and introducing his servant, the branch that would come. In chapter 6, we have him building the temple. And here we have God laying this stone before Joshua, this foundation stone, which is, and again, we looked at that in chapter 3, this is this foundation stone for the temple to be built. And it carries on in chapter 3 to speak about that when this happens, that you will call everyone your neighbor under the vine and under the fig tree. That all of God's people will be counted, not just the Jews. There won't be Jews and Gentiles. There won't be us and them, but there'll be one family of God from all people of the earth. And we looked at these verses. We're not going to go through these. We cover them all later. I just want to do a sort of a refresh as we move forward, dealing with the chapter 6, because we want to build on these things. Now, there are these 3 verses that speak about this stone that's been laid. It says that I lay that the stone, God laid in Zion a foundation stone, precious and true, and whoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed. That's that's in Isaiah is quoted in First Peter as applying to Christ. And again, the stone that the builders rejected, the same has become the head of the corner. This is a marvelous, God's doing, and it's marvelous in our eyes. That's from Psalms, in Matthew, Acts, and First Peter. That's applied to Christ. It also speaks of it being a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense in Isaiah 8:4. In Romans there in First Peter, that is speaking of Christ. Every time we see in Scripture it's spoken about this stone being laid down, that stone is Christ, and that stone is the foundation of God's temple that he is building. Now, it's interesting that in First Peter chapter 2, verse 6, 7, and 8, it quotes all these verses. I just want to read a few of the verses leading up to that, because it says some interesting things in there as well in First Peter chapter 2 about the building of this temple, the house of God. He's speaking to the Christians, saying, as newborn babes, desire the sincere milk of the word, that you may grow thereby. If so be, ye have tasted that the Lord is gracious, to whom coming as unto a living stone, as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious. Ye also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. And so here again, it's saying that Christ is that living stone, that foundation. But we are all, as believers, living stones that are built as part of the spiritual house. And so he then goes on to quote all these verses about Christ being that foundation stone for the building of the temple. And we are stones that are part of that construction. So when it speaks there about Christ building the temple, that the branch shall come forth and he shall build the temple of the Lord. The temple of the Lord that's speaking is the temple of God's people. It's his church. These are living stones made up of the members that build up the house of God for God to inhabit. And I find this interesting because when we jump back to Zechariah 6, the final verse, it mentions this about the building of the temple. It says, and they that are afar off shall come and build in the temple of the Lord, and ye shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto you. And this shall come to pass if you will diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God. Now, I just want to notice that it says that they that are afar off shall come and build the temple. Now, it told us previously that the Lord, that Christ is the one who's going to build the temple. Now it's those that are afar off that will come and build the temple. Now, when I look at Ephesians, because it picks up the same language and makes quite a powerful point about the people of God and the temple that he is building. But here, when it's speaking of those that are afar off, now those that are afar off, the people from other nations and other lands, were not allowed to be a part of the building of the temple in Jerusalem. That are specifically forbidden, and that caused a lot of the tensions in the book of Ezra between the Jews, between Zerubbabel and those from Samaria. And we see those hostilities starting here, even carrying on Jesus' day with the woman at the well saying, that the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. As the hostility starting here, when, because they weren't Jews, they weren't allowed to be a part of that building of the temple. But here they're saying those that are afar off, those that are from the other nations, are going to be part of this temple that the Lord is building. And that's exactly what we just saw in First Peter, that the Gentiles, the believers, when they've come in, they are being made living stones to build up the house of God. And so Christ is building the temple, but he's building it with his people, so that those that are afar off have come to build the temple. And so that's why we see in this passage, it's both said that Christ is building the temple and the people that are coming are building the temple, because we are the building blocks that are fit together to form the temple of God where he inhabits. Now we're going to jump to Ephesians. As we read this passage, I want you to just in your mind, just pay attention to how it speaks of those that are far off and what Christ is doing to bring them near. Now, here in Ephesians 2, starting in verse 11, we read, wherefore remember that ye being in times past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh, made by hands, that at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. This was the condition of all the Gentiles before the cross. They were cut out from Israel. They weren't allowed to be part of the building of the temple. They weren't allowed to be a part of what God was doing. But it's changed. We read, but now in Christ Jesus, you who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. As again, those that were afar off, the Gentiles that were afar off have been made nigh. Those that were afar off, that Zechariah prophesies, will be the ones that are used to build the temple. And it carries on. We pick it up in verse 16. And that he might reconcile both, this is Jew and Gentile, unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby, and came and preached peace to you who were afar off, that's the Gentiles, and to them that were nigh, that's the Jews. For through him we both have access by one Spirit unto the Father. And so again, twice here it speaks about the Gentiles that were afar off have been made nigh by the blood of Christ, have been brought close. And this is what's being spoken of there in Zechariah. When he builds this temple, those that are afar off, the Gentiles, are going to be made part of it. That's the same thing we see in Zechariah chapter 3, when it talks about that foundation stone being laid, which is Christ. And the result of that is that everyone gathered under the vine and the fig tree as the neighbors. Everyone from all parts of the earth are gathered together as the people of God. And so I wonder when Ephesians makes this point about those that are afar being brought close to God by the blood of Christ. He's made this twice leading up to this. I want us to notice what it says in the following verses, in verse 19. Now therefore, ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, and are built upon the foundations of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto the holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are builded together for an habitation of God through the Spirit. And so again here you see this exact same thing. He's talking about those that were afar off have been brought nigh, and what's happened? They have been built as part of the temple. They are building fitly framed, growing together unto a holy temple. We are builded together for an habitation of God. When Christ is spoken there in Zechariah as being the one who builds his temple, and he builds it with those that are far off, are taking part in this. This is the temple that he's speaking of, the temple of his people, the church that is being built up, that those that have come to believe, Jew and Gentile, those that are near and far, are the temple of the Lord that he is building, and he will inhabit his people. Now, after this, after he builds the temple, it says, he shall bear the glory. And this stands out to me about the Messiah, about Christ bearing the glory, because the Father is quite serious when it comes to his glory. Twice in Isaiah, he speaks saying, I will not give my glory to another. We see here in Isaiah 42 verse 8, it says, I'm the Lord, that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another, neither praise to graven images. And then again, a few chapters later in chapter 48 verse 11, for my own sake, even for my own sake, I will do it. For how should my name be polluted? I will not give my glory to another. And again, the fact that the branch here is being given the glory, that he bears the glory, is an indication that, again, it cannot be referring to Joshua. No human can bear the glory. God will not share it with another. But the question is, if he's not sharing it with another, how is it that Christ has that glory? Well, in Hebrews, if we jump to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2 and 3, notice what it says here about Christ. It speaks about, it's speaking about the Father, that God has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory, and the express image of his person, and holding all things by the word of his power, when he hath by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. Now notice how it's speaking there, it describes Christ. And right in the middle there, it says he is he who being the brightness of his glory. Christ is the brightness of the Father's glory, the express image of his person. This is the nature and the character of Jesus Christ himself. This is why he can bear that glory, because that is who he is. And again, after him bearing the glory, we get this message that he shall sit and rule upon his throne, and he shall be a priest upon his throne. And we've covered it's a very really understanding Christ as our high priest there in Hebrews. And in Revelation, we see him returning as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That as now he's sitting there in the judgment as a priest. He, after he ascended, he was sat down on the right hand of the Father. There's many verses that speak about this. But I just find there's another interesting sort of type antitype when it comes to applying this to Christ, being that priest upon his throne. Remember, Joshua the high priest that's in there, he's from the tribe of Levi. He's a priest after the order of Levi, but there's another priesthood that is different, where we see that the priests are a king. And we find that in Genesis, when speaking of Melchizedek, it says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. We see that the order of Melchizedek was a priest that was it was both priest and king. The king of Salem there being king of righteousness or king of peace, as it tells us in Hebrews. And as we know in Hebrews 5:6, it says, and he saith in another place, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Christ is made a priest after the order of Melchizedek because he is both priest and king. That's a separate priesthood, that there was not Levitical. The Levites never had access to this, that they were never kings. They never got to rule. They specifically didn't have an inheritance among the rest of the tribes because their inheritance was the priesthood. But here, Christ is both king and priest. He both rules and ministers. And finally, we get to that final statement, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. And as we've gone through this, you see that clearly this is a messianic practice. This is speaking about Christ. Everything in here applies to what he is doing, is his role as Messiah, as the incarnate Son of God, his work in building God's people as his temple to inhabit, bearing the glory, being the priest and king. And it comes to this final statement, sort of the climax of this whole thing, is the counsel of peace shall be between them both. That Christ is in those counsels with the Father, and just for clarity, we know that those are the Father's counsels. It says that in Acts 4 here, when the disciples have just been released from prison, and they're sort of reciting the persecution they faced and what had happened with Christ and the rejection of him by the leaders. And it says, of a truth, against thy holy child Jesus. So it's speaking to the Father here in this prayer, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined to be done. So it's the Father's counsel, and Christ is in those counsels. The counsel of peace is between them both. And there are a number of these verses in Scripture that speak about both the Father and the Son. Often we hear verses that speak about, for example, in Genesis, let us make man in our image. Yes, there's more than one. But while it speaks about there being more than one, it doesn't actually tell us how many. But when it says the counsel shall be between them both is a very specific number. It excludes anything less than two, and it excludes anything more than two. And that's where we see this very powerful truth of the Father and the Son, the counsel be between them both. I'm just going to look at a few other verses. There's on here in Matthew 11, verse 25, and I'm going to read this through because something interesting coming out here that links in with that counsel of peace and why it's only the Father and Son that can take part in that. We read, at that time Jesus answered and said, I thank thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes. Even so, Father, for so it seemeth good in thy sight. All things are delivered unto me of my Father, and no man knoweth the Son but the Father. Neither knoweth any man the Father save the Son, and he to whomsoever the Son will reveal him. Now, so Jesus is, having this moment of prayer to the Father, and he thanks the Father for the way he's doing things. And I just find interesting there. It says, even so, Father, for so it seemeth good in thy sight. That this is what the Father's done according to his counsel. But notice Jesus doesn't just say this was the Father's counsel. It says this is the Father's counsel. And then it says, all things are delivered unto me of my Father. That the way things are being unfolded here on earth is according to the Father's counsel. And this is a counsel that I have part in. All these things have been delivered unto me of my Father. And he carries on, no man knoweth the Son but the Father. That's an incredibly exclusive statement. There's no other being in heaven or earth that has that type of connection, that type of relationship with the Son except the Father. And it's the same the other way. Neither knoweth any man the Father save the Son. That this Father and Son relationship in that counsel where God is governing, that there is no one else able to take part in that. And then it carries on that, and he to whomsoever the Son will reveal him. That this sort of is a relationship that we want to be invited into, but and that we can come to grow in our knowledge of them. But that counsel piece between them both, that relationship between the Father and Son, is such a precious truth, and such a powerful one as well. That this closeness with the Father and Son, this relationship they have, the preciousness with which they have, that just sort of magnifies the love of God, and that he was willing to give up his Son, that he was willing to send his Son to die for us. And we carry on. In Revelation, we see again, and he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of the Lamb, our throne of God and of the Lamb. Again, we see the throne of God, and there's both God and the Lamb. There's both the Father and Son there. And Proverbs 30 with creation, it speaks about who has ascended into heaven or descended, who hath gathered the winds in his midst, who hath bound the waters in a garment, who hath established the ends of the earth. What is his name? And what is his Son's name, if thou can tell? Again, we have this creation happening, and it's both the Father and Son. On the thrones in heaven, it's both the Father and Son. And this relationship within the Godhead is both the Father and Son. And the counsels of peace is both the Father and Son. And as the more you study this, the more you see this truth spread throughout all of Scripture. And as I mentioned, we started looking at this in Genesis 3. There's that, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion of the fish of the sea, and over the fowls of the air, and the cattle, and over every creeping thing upon the earth. And much is made of that, let us make man in our image. So that there's a more than one there about plurality. And the question is left, who is that us? And when we look at Zechariah 6, when we look at Revelation, when we look at Matthew, when we look at Proverbs, what is his name, what is his Son's name, if thou can tell, it becomes clear that the us is them both. That this is the Father and Son, that this is sort of that final truth and that prophetic utterance that Zechariah 6 was leading us towards, was this truth of the Father and Son, that the us is them both, the Father and Son in those counsels. And so I just want to read back through this prophetic message that's uttered there in Zechariah 6. Now we've been through all these points. He says, and speak unto him, saying, thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, behold the man whose name is the branch, and he shall grow up out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Even he shall build the temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule upon his throne. And he shall be a priest upon his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. And when we read that in its full sort of prophetic messianic understandings, we see how full that is of meaning and the picture that God is trying to deliver his people. All these previous 8 visions were drawing the people closer and closer to this, to understanding who is the one that is doing all of this for them. What are they to understand about Christ? And so just to recap, these are the points. His name is the branch. He is the incarnate Son of God who was born in Bethlehem, yet his origins are from everlasting, from the days of eternity. He will build the temple with the people of God, a living temple, because God doesn't want to dwell in a stone made of brick and a building made of brick and stone. God wants to dwell in his people. He wants to be among us, and he will bear the glory, because as he says in John 17, he says, glorify me with the glory I had with thee before the world was, because that's who he is. That's his nature. He is the divine Son of God, and he will rule as a priest upon his throne. He is ministering for us at the same time as ruling over us. He's not ruling over us for his benefit, but for our benefit. And the counsel of peace shall be between them both. That relationship in the Father and Son is central for the entire plan of salvation to be carried out. The central point of that, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Nothing else in any of these visions here leading up to this point, nothing else could have happened if it wasn't for this relationship with the Father and Son. Nothing else in Scripture. There could have been no plan of salvation if it wasn't for this central truth that we find here. And so all of these 8 visions are leading us to this point. God was telling his people this story of what was happening when they were in captivity, why they were taken there, how he wants to restore them, the blessings he wants to bestow upon them, how he wants to govern them, what he's going to do for them in the sanctuary, and what he's going to do for them with the ministering angels. And all of this understanding, this was sort of this story, that this narrative that God was telling to his people, leading them to understand that all of this was happening, and Christ will be the one who is carrying this out, because he is the branch. He is the one that built the temple. He is the one that bears the glory. He is the one who rules the priest upon his throne. And he is the one that shares the counsel with the Father. All of this was leading people to that truth. And then the chapter finishes with this. It speaks about them in the final verse, then building the temple. And then it says, and all this, everything that has happened, not just in this passage, but in all these visions, shall come to pass if, and there is if ye will diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God. So all of these visions, this entire journey that God's wanting to take his people on, like Christ coming as the Messiah would happen either way. But the if here is if they wanted to be part of this story. God's telling them the story of where his people were, how he's wanting to lead them, and where he's wanting to lead them to for their future on earth in this life and in eternity. And he's asking them, if you want your life to be a part of the story, he's calling them to obey the voice of the Lord, to move forward, to not be stuck in traditions, in your own priorities, in your own ways, to not be sidetracked by the things of the world and the distractions that are so readily around us, but to move forward in faith, to obey the voice of God. And if we do that, then we will have a part in this story that God is telling of the restoration of his people, of the service of the sanctuary, of the ministry of angels, of the work of Christ on our behalf. That is the message of the entire first half of the book of Zechariah, that God is leading his people to this point. And at the end of this first half, he leaves them with this question. Everything I've shown you can be yours. You can take a part of this if you will make the choice. If you will choose to follow God and worship him. It's almost like a reaffirming of the covenant when he brought them out of Egypt, and he spoke the 10 commandments, and he says, that this is my law, and then he gave them the rest of the old covenant there as well, and says, these are the blessings and curses These are the blessings you will have if you choose. And they said, all the Lord has said we would do and be obedient. Yet they failed. And so God's coming back to them. And this time he's giving them this prophetic narrative. And he's saying, all of this can be yours. These blessings in this story can be yours if you will now choose. And this was the message for them. And it's the same for us today. This is the choice that God wants to lead us with. Everything we've looked at and what God's doing with his people in all of these visions and what that means for us today, we can have a part of that. We can have a part in that sanctuary service. We can experience the ministration of angels. We can experience Christ working for us as our priest and king, the one who bears the glory, the one who shares the counsel of the Father. All that is available for us if we would make that decision, if we would choose to diligently obey his voice, not half-heartedly, not sometimes, but he requires this consecration and commitment. And then we will have our part in this story. We will have our part in the narrative that God is laying out before us.